Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is John Kiriakou. I'm very pleased to have him here today. He will be here today to talk about his past in the CIA, some of the revelations he made quite a long time ago now, but still carry weight in the kind of political discussion today, and also his kind of reflections now, obviously being outside the CIA and kind of that sort of lifestyle, to see kind of what he thinks about the US government then and now, and kind of through the war on terror, and kind of maybe even some current events today, the insight he can bring. But I really appreciate you coming on today, John. How you doing?
Happy to do it. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so I mean, lots of people will be familiar with you, maybe more obviously in the US, and the people who, follow kind of the war on terror and foreign policy. But can you just kind of give people a brief background about yourself? You don't need to go into mass detail, but just, obviously your career in the CIA, kind of leading up to your revelations, and then kind of what happened after that, and then we can kind of pick it up from there.
Sure. I spent 15 years in the CIA, beginning in January of 1990. I rose to become, well, at first the head of counterterrorism operations in Pakistan after the 9/11 attacks. I went back to headquarters and took a job as the executive assistant to the CIA's deputy director for operations, and left the CIA, went into the private sector. Blew the whistle on the CIA's torture report when I was in the torture program when I was in the private sector, and then went to work for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as the senior investigator. The FBI prosecuted me for my torture whistleblowing, and I went to prison for 23 months. Since then, I got out 9 years ago, and since then I've been mostly in media. I have a daily radio show, I have a weekly TV show, and a syndicated newspaper column. I speak at universities and colleges around the world. And that's about it in a nutshell.
Yeah, obviously, again, that was nice and brief in a nutshell. I mean, I encourage people to, check out kind of, if you type in your name, much like Matthew Ho and other people, there's lots and lots of information, but definitely more for people like you, and, go check out your interviews. But yeah, that was definitely a nutshell. But obviously, you had a kind of an interesting career, to put it to short, and obviously life.
It wasn't a straight line, that's for sure.
Absolutely. So, I mean, again, like I said before, I'm happy to obviously talk about, your torture revelations and some of your experiences in prison, but you've done it. I know you've done it a million times. So I do encourage people to maybe check out your original interview with ABC. But can you kind of just talk us through what happened there? Because, what you discussed in that interview were kind of the first, official or ex-official to report on it, but you didn't actually speak about anything necessarily classified there. It was later. So, I've kind of heard you speak about it as I watched one of your fairly recent interviews. I think it was a Turkish broadcast, saying that you went there and you didn't obviously see what happened later to you coming. So, when you've gone there to speak about those revelations, did you think it was going to have the massive impact it did? And can you just tell people, because we obviously talk about US torture and what happened there, but what you reported on, from what I watched, it was more just about, the waterboarding, and you even said, it could just be a slap on their stomach, and it was being directly, going to the deputy. Can we do this? Can we do that? I'd like to maybe get into maybe some of the revelations since then, but can you just break down kind of what you actually spoke about there, and I guess the kind of instant fame it kind of gave you, those that led to obviously you going to prison eventually for something else.
Right. In generalities, I said three things. I said that the CIA was torturing its prisoners. I said that torture was official U.S. government policy. And I said that the policy had been personally approved by the president. In specifics, I talked about the 10 torture techniques that the CIA had been using against prisoners, with waterboarding being, or supposed to have been, the most severe. It wasn't the most severe. There were two legal techniques that were more severe than waterboarding, techniques that led to the deaths of prisoners. And then there were illegal or unauthorized techniques that CIA officers were using on prisoners. The FBI investigated me for a full year after that interview, from December of 2007 until December of 2008, and then they declined to prosecute me, finding that I had not committed a crime. But then when Barack Obama became president, John Brennan, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor, asked the Justice Department to secretly reopen the case against me. And they investigated me for another 3 years until January of 2012. And then I was charged with 5 felonies, including 3 counts of espionage. Those ended up being dropped because I hadn't committed espionage. But to make the whole thing go away, I took a plea to a lesser charge, and was able to end this nightmare by doing that.
Yeah, am I correct that it went from potentially between like 35 to 45 years to about 30 months?
Yeah, it was 45 years. I ended up accepting a deal at 30 months, and I did 23 months.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe just in a moment kind of get into your kind of just experience in prison. Obviously, I know it was a kind of lower security, but there was still lots of people there who committed much worse crimes than you did. If you can even call what you did, obviously, a crime outside of the legal framework. But at that time where you reported on that, during that period, was there also, not direct US CIA torture, but, kind of the program extraordinary renditioning where, we'd pick people up, take them to a country like Egypt or Jordan where they would maybe do something like torture? Would that be accurate?
Oh, yes. There's a difference between rendition and extraordinary rendition. So rendition is, let's say we'll say Tunisian, and I catch you in Pakistan. A rendition is I send you back to Tunisia and you face the music in your home country. Extraordinary rendition is, again, let's say you're from Tunisia. I pick you up in Pakistan. I place you under arrest. I don't tell the Tunisian government that I have you. And instead, I send you to Jordan or Turkey or Egypt or Algeria for you to be tortured and interrogated, and then maybe they'll let you out someday. Maybe they won't, and you'll just disappear. That's an extraordinary rendition.
In the context, when we talk about US torture, because if you go back and maybe watch your interview and you're just talking about, the slap on the belly, the sleep deprivation, making them stay up for 48 hours while standing up, or waterboarding, does that kind of, if people did go back and see that and not know the rest of the context, would that be misleading in the rest of the picture of US torture, including taking them to third countries, even if they didn't do it themselves? Or was the kind of torture program actually, does it sound exaggerated because it was only actually that, but the term torture conjures up maybe stuff that enemies of, the West previously did, or, go on.
Oh, no. Torture's torture. And those techniques, while some of them may not sound terribly severe, things like sleep deprivation were fatal. Another was the cold cell. We can get into these specifics. The American Psychological Association, the APA, did a study on sleep deprivation. And they said that people begin to lose their minds at 7 days with no sleep. They begin to die of organ failure at 9 days. The CIA was authorized to keep people awake for 12 days. So that's well past the insanity and defense guidelines. And when I say sleep deprivation, I'm not just talking about, nudging somebody and keeping them awake. You're chained to an eye bolt in the ceiling so that you can't sit or lay or get comfortable in any way. Music is blasted 24 hours a day. You have industrial strength bright lights on you 24 hours a day. So it's just impossible to even nod off or to nap.
There. Sorry, my camera went. Sorry, carry on.
it's impossible to refresh yourself in any way. And then, like I say, days into it, people begin to hallucinate, they begin to lose their minds, and then their organs begin to shut down. Another one was the cold cell. This was a similar situation where the prisoner would be chained to an eye bolt in the ceiling. He would be stripped naked, and his cell would be chilled to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And then every hour, a CIA officer would go into the cell and throw a bucket of ice water on him. We killed multiple prisoners using that technique, and that technique was never authorized by the Justice Department. Once the Senate torture report came out, we learned about other things that were being done. Russian roulette, for example, or shoving a tube up a prisoner's rectum and forcing hummus into his rectum. That's not authorized by anybody, and it's certainly not recommended by any physician. With Abu Zubaydah, the senior prisoner that I was responsible for capturing, besides Russian roulette, they threatened to drill a hole into his brain with a drill. They learned that he had an irrational fear of insects, and so they put a diaper on him, they put him in a coffin, and dumped a box of cockroaches in there with him, and closed the casket just to make him crazy as the bugs were crawling all over him. They kept him in there for 7 days. So these were far more damaging, even if only psychologically, than I think most Americans realized.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite, much more than obviously at the time when you did that interview. A belly slap compared to some of the stuff you said there doesn't sound at all even, comparable. Just going back to the kind of where the US would maybe send someone to like a third country, around these kind of black sites we heard. What sort of things happened there? I know it may be obvious to ask it, but just for the audience, why did the US send them there, and just how complicit are we in there? Would it be the third country would take them, like Egypt would kind of volunteer themselves, or the US would ask them to kind of, can you take this person, as we need plausible deniability, and your whole system that wouldn't let it get out anyway because it's a corrupt regime?
Well, that's not easily answered, because I should preface this by saying that the CIA has never admitted to the location of any of these black sites. The press have reported on the locations extensively, but the CIA has never made a formal admission. So we're talking about countries that in general are not the obvious bad guys that you would think. We're not talking about Egypt or Jordan, for example. We're talking about, well, I won't say what we're talking about, but you can Google it, and the reporting is correct.
Eastern Europe.
Eastern Europe, for the most part, yes.
Yeah.
So what makes this such a crazy situation is that in many of these cases, the presidents and prime ministers of these countries didn't know that these black sites existed in their own countries. These were handshake deals between the CIA director and the directors of the host country's intelligence services, and the information was kept from the political leadership of that country. In almost every case, it was the CIA approaching that host country. And the reason that the CIA wanted these facilities in foreign countries was because the prisoner would then have no constitutional rights, no right to face his accusers in a court of law, no right to habeas corpus, no right to be judged by a jury of his peers, no right to respect for human rights, no rights at all. And the CIA at the same time maintained plausible deniability. And it worked for a while. It worked for, 3.5 years, at least 4.5 years. So it worked for the CIA.
I know you've discussed it before, and obviously it's a bit of a debate. And at the time of your interview, you thought that the techniques, the enhanced interrogation techniques used at the time, did have some use. Whether it was morally right or not, you go over saying, I've still kind of torn in my mind. But when he asked you, do you think it worked, provided the information you needed, you said yes. Now, all of these years on, overall, not just that specific case, but overall torture, do you think it works, or
No,
it works?
absolutely not. And this was a lie that the CIA perpetuated. I was wrong in that interview in 2007 because I had been lied to, like every senior officer in the CIA had been lied to. The CIA had contracted out this torture program to two contract psychologists by the name of James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen. They were paid $108 million for their program. And when Abu Zubaydah, who was the first high-value target that we captured, was taken to a black site, he was initially interrogated by the FBI, and the FBI got him to talk. This was an FBI agent by the name of Ali Soufan. Ali was successful in getting him to open up, and he gave Ali actionable intelligence that disrupted future attacks and saved American lives. The CIA was very upset that the FBI had primacy in this case, and CIA Director George Tenet at the time went to President Bush, asked him to remove the FBI from the secret site and to allow the CIA to take over. Now, here's the important part. The CIA and the FBI so hated each other, and I mean from the time of the creation of the CIA in 1947 until the post 9/11 period, that their computer systems were not even compatible. So Ali Soufan was collecting this golden intelligence, reporting it back in FBI channels, and the FBI was not sharing it with the CIA. So when Ali Soufan and the other FBI agents were removed from the secret site and Mitchell and Jessen took over, they began torturing Abu Zubaydah, and he completely went silent. So what they did in order to justify the $108 million expenditure was they took Ali Soufan's information from the files at the secret site, they retyped it in CIA channels and said, look, we waterboarded him one time, and look at the amazing information he gave us. Well, at the CIA, remember, they didn't have access to the FBI reporting. And they said, wow, look what happened. And I said to a colleague of mine at the time, I think it's immoral, I think it's unethical, and it's certainly illegal. But maybe I'm wrong, and it does actually work. Well, it wasn't until 2009 when the CIA Inspector General's report was released that we realized that this was all based on a fraud committed by Mitchell and Jessen, and that not only did the torture program not work, but that they had lied about it in the end.
Yeah, no, it is interesting watching you then. Again, that's the information you had at the time. And obviously, it's kind of when you look at these subjects, many of them, even with books, I don't always love getting ones around the time it happened because so much information comes out
later
after. The internet has only grown and grown and grown and grown, and WikiLeaks and these leaks that come out. So at the time when something happens, it's kind of like, I wonder what's going to happen. Come out in 5 years. So it was interesting watching in that interview then and interviews to this. So just kind of, I still am here. I just thought I'd get your thoughts on Guantanamo Bay, as you kind of mentioned again in that interview with ABC that you wasn't sure what you thought about torture, if it worked, or they worked, but is it moral or immoral? So what kind of your thoughts about Guantanamo Bay? Because you mentioned that interview, it was definitely un-American. We want to represent the shining light of the world and democracy. We can't be doing these things. So what is kind of, don't know why my camera keeps going. What do you make of Guantanamo Bay and all the people who are kind of there that are interlinked, obviously, with the war on terror? Some of them would never have been charged. It's not even on kind of, United States soil. What do you make of it, and why does the US still have it? Surely this is a stain on America. Do they really need it?
Yeah, Guantanamo is a stain on America. First of all, we don't need a prison at Guantanamo Bay to hold al-Qaeda prisoners or anybody else. And secondly, we don't need Guantanamo. We don't need a base on Guantanamo. We don't use it for anything other than a prison that I believe is unconstitutional in its very existence. And the Cubans don't want us there. You know, in all the years that we were there, that Fidel Castro was in power in Cuba, he never cashed the checks that the American government sent for the rent on Guantanamo. Never cashed the checks. So the first time I had even considered Guantanamo or had any reason to think about Guantanamo was in March of 2002. We had done a series of raids all over Pakistan, and we had literally filled the Rawalpindi jail with Arab prisoners. And the Pakistani intelligence service came to me and said, look, the jail is full. We literally can't squeeze one more prisoner into Rawalpindi. You have to do something with them. So I called headquarters from Pakistan. I said, the jail's full. The Pacs want us to take all these prisoners and just get rid of them. What should we do? What should I do with them? And the response was to put them on a C-12 cargo plane and send them to Guantanamo. And I said, Guantanamo, Cuba? Yes. I said, why would we send them to Cuba? And the response was that we were going to take them all to Cuba and hold them temporarily while we decided in which federal district court we would try them, because 9/11 was still an open criminal case and federal crimes had been committed in Boston, New York, and Washington, and the Eastern District of Virginia, which is where the Pentagon sits. I said, that's a terrific idea. So the original plan was only to keep these people in Guantanamo for 3 or 4 weeks and then send them to these federal districts to face trial. And then, you know, once the attorneys and the neoconservative politicians began talking and came to the conclusion that at Guantanamo, none of these people had any rights, including, you know, the right of habeas corpus, then, you know, the end was written. And we knew that nobody would ever get justice.
Okay. Let me just, sorry about that, everyone. Hopefully you heard everything we just finished off about Guantanamo Bay and the fact no one has their rights. I did actually ask in the original long question, why does the US still have it? If it is this same and it's this dirty, not really secret, this dirty open secret of the treatment of these prisoners, America tries to portray itself as this. I mean, it's had sanctions on Cuba for 60 years, but has it obviously on their soil, and you obviously spoke about how Castro didn't take the money. So why does the US keep it there? Is it just bureaucracy to just someone's holding it to close down?
No, it's more cynical than that. It's more cynical than that. There are really 3 reasons why they keep it. Number one, they keep it just because they can and because it's a thorn in the side of the Cubans. That's the least important reason why they keep it. Secondly, they keep it because Congress passed a very ill-advised law in the first year or 2 of the Obama administration, prohibiting the transfer of any prisoner from Guantanamo into an American prison. That was an act of sheer and blatant cowardice. You know, we have not just maximum security penitentiaries here, we have 2 supermax prisons that hold some of the most dangerous people in the world. So why would we be afraid of a handful of characters in Guantanamo? It doesn't make any sense. And third, we keep it because they simply do not have any rights there. You know, we know, for example, from the Senate torture report that Abu Zubaydah will never be released under any circumstances. And when he dies at Guantanamo, he is to be cremated and his ashes cast into the Caribbean. You can't do that in the American prison system, where he has the right to counsel and the right to appeal and the right to habeas corpus and the right to go to the Supreme Court and the right to be met by the Red Cross and Amnesty International. He doesn't get any of that at Guantanamo. None of them do. So really, those are the 3 reasons why we keep Guantanamo. I agree with you. It's a stain on the country. And it's an example of American hypocrisy. It's something that we should be ashamed of.
Yeah, I'm glad you used that term, hypocrisy, as again, I know I've spoken to Matthew Ho, who obviously worked, in the State Department as a political officer in Afghanistan. Obviously, it was involved as a Marine Corps company commander, and it's almost hard for someone looking in to really believe that the people in the government, in the CIA, in the State Department really believe in what they say, democracy, about free will, about free speech, all these different things. And then you hear like lots of people like you and other people say, there were so many nice guys in the CIA. Obviously, you seem to be obviously a very nice guy, and then people say the same things time and time again. But just looking from it, it's just impossible not to kind of think these people can't really believe this, because they say they believe in democracy, and then since the CIA's founding, they've overthrown governments. They've put money into elections. They constantly meddle. They meddle in US domestic politics. Every country, not just African countries or the Middle East.
Right.
They have things like Guantanamo Bay. They put people like you in prison, Julian Assange. So I guess you obviously believed in what you was doing. I'd like to think, obviously, leading you into the CIA. I know you said you enjoyed your time there. On reflection, what is your view on the CIA, the US government? Do they believe what they're saying? Is it yes and no, as in yes, people at the lower levels or even sometimes higher, but when you get to that kind of leadership level, they don't believe in democracy. They have an imperial view, or they may think it's right, like the British Empire thought they was doing it for good reasons, civilization or missionaries. So what are your reflections on it now, at the time you was there, and kind of now being out of it?
That's a very complicated question. So I'm going to start the answer by saying that a CIA psychiatrist once told me that the CIA actively seeks to hire people who have sociopathic tendencies, not sociopaths. Sociopaths have no conscience. They are unable to feel remorse or guilt. People who have sociopathic tendencies do feel remorse or guilt, but are happy to work in moral, legal, and ethical gray areas. For example, I will freely admit to you that I have sociopathic tendencies, in that I have a conscience. I know right from wrong. I try to do right. But if my bosses needed for me to break into somebody's house and plant a camera and a bug, I was perfectly happy to do that because I believed we were the good guys. Now, like in politics or in corporate culture, even when you try to weed out the sociopaths, you're going to fail. Because they don't have a conscience, they will blow right through a polygraph exam. And just like in politics and business, they will rise to the top of their profession on the backs of the people around them because they don't feel guilt. So when you have somebody who's intensely patriotic and who finds himself in a senior position without the ability to feel guilt, then you've created a monster. That's when you end up with a torture program and a rendition program and a secret prison program and international kidnappings and hit squads that fly around the world and assassinate people, and the overthrow of governments, like you said, not just in the depths of Africa. The first government that the CIA overthrew, and it's well documented, was in 1948, and it was the Italian government.
Tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over. For example, in Europe, in 47, 48, 49, the Greeks and the Italians, we
don't do that now, though. We don't mess around other people's elections, Jim.
Only for a very good cause.
Can you do that? Do a Vine video on a former CIA director.
Only for a very good cause in
Okay.
the interests of democracy.
All right, thanks for being here. It's always great.
So, yeah, on the one hand, everybody at the CIA believes that he's a good guy and he's on the right team, the winning team, because we are that shining beacon of hope for the rest of the world. And on the other hand, he's perfectly happy to commit crimes, in some cases terrible crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, because he believes that it's for the good of the country. It's very easy at the CIA to lose perspective and to lose the ability to determine what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah, no, I would agree with what you say. As much as from the outside, it would be easy just to perceive it as that. It's like, kind of with the Iraq war, which obviously you, at the time in 2002 in Pakistan, obviously, you was kind of up to date with how that was moving. But it's easy to say the Iraq war is just about oil. This is, or any, whatever war you want to attach one reason, but it's just not that simple. And I've kind of, as I've looked into it more, come to the conclusion that it's not just that, because there's so many different factors. It could be, you can have the more nefarious, interests, business interests, whether it's arms, oil. But it could also be someone who wants to, for their own ego, to be, be part of turning it into a democratic country in the Middle East, or, just for their own careerism, or they truly do believe that Iraq was involved in 9/11, or it's worth getting rid of Saddam Hussein, even, just because he's that much of a bad guy, let's give it a go. So there's so many different factors. So it would obviously work the same with the CIA and kind of the government. But with the war on terror, looking kind of through it now, and obviously kind of in the context of, again, with Israel and Palestine, that, terrorism comes up time and time again. Do you think the war on terror created, well, it did with obviously ISIS, and then, what kind of happened in Syria. But do you think the war on terror, the way they went about it, not just after 9/11 using like special forces to go after Al-Qaeda, they're invading all these countries, did the whole war on terror create more terrorists, more groups? And was it really ever about the war on terror, or was it about using it to invade the countries they wanted, or use it to overthrow the leaders of unfriendly governments in the region?
It was very briefly, I'll use the word momentarily, about the war on terror. It was very briefly about destroying Al-Qaeda in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. But to answer your first question first, the U.S. response to 9/11 created far more terrorists than it ever destroyed. I can't tell you how many people, and I mean, I can't tell you because there were so many, I can't even recall how many Al-Qaeda fighters I interrogated who said that they never had any problem with the United States until we bombed their village. We killed their parents, we killed their cousins, we killed their friends, we killed whomever. And then they took up arms against the United States. So this wanton drone war that we initiated in 2001 has done nothing but harm and weaken our country. That's separate from the creation of ISIS, for example. ISIS came out of the Iraq War. And why did we invade Iraq? Not because Iraq had anything to do with 9/11. It didn't. Al-Qaeda hated Saddam Hussein more than they hated us. But we did it for revenge. We did it for revenge for the 1990-91 Gulf War, and for the attempt in 1992-93 to kill President George H.W. Bush. And so, this is just, it's bad short-term foreign policy thinking that has gotten us into these inextricable predicaments. So now, I mean, we're more than 22 years past the 9/11 attacks, and we're still in the region, and we're still fighting, and we're still droning, and we're still, sending carrier battle groups. It's, we're still fighting the same people in the same countries, and More and more terrorists are being born, and more terrorists are being converted. And, you know, you would think that after 22 years, we would have finally come to the conclusion that our response was incorrect, and that perhaps we should try a different policy. But I don't think we've gotten there yet.
Yeah, just as you mentioned, obviously, about the Iraq War, and obviously you were the chief of counterterrorism in Pakistan, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong after, but, you know, you obviously had information probably privy to the public wouldn't have. You just mentioned there, you know, the Iraq War, some of the reasons behind it was revenge for the Gulf War and the attempted assassination. Is that information that you're kind of speculating on someone who's looked at it since, or someone who's around the people then making the decisions, hearing their conversations?
We knew about it back then. You know, I say in my very first book that when I got back from Pakistan, I was promoted on the strength of the Abu Zubaydah capture, and I was named executive assistant to the deputy director. So on my first day in that job, I went to the deputy director and I said, "So what are we doing?" And he said, "I can't tell you. You have to go up to the 6th floor and sign your secrecy agreements and then come back down and we'll talk about what we're doing." I said, "Okay." So I went up to the 6th floor. There was a security officer there waiting for me, and he had 6 agreements, secrecy agreements, lined up on a desk. And I signed each one at a time, where I swore never to ever discuss anything having to do with my job unless it was declassified subsequently. So I signed each one of the 6, and when I was done, I said, "So, what's up?" And he said, "Well," and this was in May of 2002. He said, "Next year, in 2003, we're going to invade Iraq. We're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein. We're going to open the world's largest Air Force base, and we're going to move all of our air assets out of Saudi Arabia into Iraq. That way," he said, "we can deprive Osama bin Laden of the ability to say that we are polluting the land of the 2 holy mosques." I was so shocked, having just come back from Pakistan. All I could think to stammer out was, "But we haven't caught bin Laden yet." And he said, "Buddy, the decision's already been made, and the battle lines have been drawn." He said, "The pro-war entities are the Office of the Vice President, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council. The anti-war side is the CIA, the State Department, and the Joint Chiefs." He said, "The decision's been made. We're going to war." Well, at the CIA and the State Department and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we knew why they wanted to go to war, because this was the neoconservative wet dream, right? You can finally kill Saddam Hussein after all these years of humiliation, where we tell him, "You better not cross this line," and then he crosses it. And then he says, "Now what are you going to do?" "Well, what we're going to do is we're going to make a new line and say, 'Well, you better not cross that one.'" And then he crosses that one. And then you say, "Well, you better not cross the 3rd one, or we're going to go to the UN and we're going to file a complaint." Well, they were tired of that. And so they decided, no, we're just going to kill him. And that's what the policy was.
Yeah, you mentioned there obviously about bin Laden and looking back on the war on terror. So, okay, 9/11 happens, Al-Qaeda attacks the US. They're based out of Afghanistan, right? They're going to go, you know, and the US population, you know, wanted vengeance, wanted to see some action, and they could have just gone after Al-Qaeda, but they go after the Taliban in Afghanistan and Iraq, and, you know, we haven't even got bin Laden then, and all this stuff's going on. And then obviously they get bin Laden in 2011, and there's obviously, I kind of just wanted to see your thoughts on this, the whole Tora Bora story, where right at the start in 2001, late 2001, maybe early 2002,
No, that was 2001.
Yeah, bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in Tora Bora, and there's obviously been discussion and debate since then, as there was kind of some red flags that went that people that they got away a bit too easy and they didn't bring kind of the full force and orders are kind of put out. And there's been a few people who have come out who were involved who have said that. Do you think that it was genuinely the leadership got away to Pakistan, or did certain people?
There was a double agent. Yeah, there was a double agent. One of the translators working for the commander of Central Command was sent up the mountain in Tora Bora to negotiate for bin Laden's surrender. And he came back down and he said, bin Laden had agreed to surrender. They want you to let all the women and children go. And they're gathering their things and they just want to be able to surrender at sunrise. So they're going to come down the mountain at sunrise, but you have to promise to let the women and children go. And we said, fine. In fact, they used those hours of darkness to go down the mountain on the Pakistani side. As it turned out, with bin Laden dressed as a woman and having escaped in the bed of a pickup truck into Pakistan. So we learned years later that it was the translator who was actually sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. He helped them engineer the escape. And that was allowed to happen because CENTCOM trusted him. And they believed that he really had arranged for the surrender of bin Laden and the rest of the Al-Qaeda leadership.
That's it. I hadn't heard that perspective. That's why I thought I'd ask you. Obviously, the other side of the story was that certain kind of figures in the US military and White House didn't want to catch bin Laden that early, because if they caught him then and a lot of the leadership, the war on terror is kind of done and dusted, they can't get on with their political agendas in Afghanistan, Iraq. You don't think there's any weight to that?
No, you don't. See, this is something that people who perpetuate these conspiracies don't understand. Policymakers don't need for there to be a trigger to invade a country or to take their resources. If the US wanted to triple defense spending, it would just triple defense spending. If the US wanted to invade Afghanistan, it would invade Afghanistan. It didn't need for, the leadership of the Taliban to escape or Al-Qaeda to escape and to prepare. They just do what they want. If they want to invade a country and seize the oil, they invade the country and seize the oil. We don't need for any trigger to take place in the beginning.
Yeah, no, there's perfectly reasonable explanation. I hadn't really made my mind up about it. I just thought it'd be interesting to get your perspective as someone who maybe since then, who's obviously involved in those early years, maybe reflected on it and had a look, but that's absolutely fine. Just again, actually kind of on the terrorism side. So again, I haven't watched you too much kind of about Syria, but what are your thoughts on, obviously at your time in the CIA, you're focused on catching Al-Qaeda and the terrorists, and the public are told all throughout the war on terror it's about catching terrorists and stopping regimes who encourage it. And then in Syria, whether people want to argue we willfully armed terrorists or al-Nursra or ISIS, or we kind of allowed it to happen by we would give it to the so-called moderate rebels, but they weren't the stronger fighting force, so we would fall into them. And either way you look at it, obviously we was on the side of overthrowing the Syrian regime and Assad, and so were they. So we was on the same team, even if you'd say we had nothing to do with them. What are your thoughts on kind of the whole Syria situation, the empowerment of these groups and the territories obviously ISIS eventually took in Iraq and Syria, and the fighting strength of al-Nusra? Well, where do you kind of fall on this as someone whose job was to obviously prevent terrorism? How did we go from that to this, or do you disagree with those kind of arguments?
No. I think your analysis of the situation in Syria is correct. I think that the United States has had a lot of foreign policy failures over the years, and certainly a lot of foreign policy failures recently. I think Syria is among the most significant, most complete foreign policy failure. First of all, it was the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq that led to the creation of of ISIS, right? And ISIS was more radical than al-Qaeda because they believed that al-Qaeda was not, they were not anti-American enough. They were not violent enough. And so they decided to attack the United States from outside the confines of what had been al-Qaeda. Okay, that's number one. Number two, the US made a terrible strategic error in trying to identify so-called moderates in Syria. There is no such thing as a Syrian moderate. The Kurds aside, the Kurds are a different issue. We have long-standing relations with Kurds in both Syria and Iraq. They are generally pro-American and have been pro-American for many decades, for generations. Donald Trump's ill-advised comments about Kurds aside, we've had years and years and years of very close relations with the Kurds. The strategic error came in pretending that the Nusra Front, previously known in Syria as al-Qaeda, was somehow magically moderate one day. One day we woke up and they were suddenly the moderates in Syria.
What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I've just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens, thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. Now you think I'm exaggerating? Take a look. Where did all of this go? So now what's happening? All of a sudden, everybody's awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was al-Qaeda in Iraq, which when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space and territory in eastern Syria, worked with al-Nusra, who we declared a terrorist group early on, and we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying them.
Another strategic error in Syria was the decision to support a regime change operation against Bashar al-Assad. Terrible, critical mistake for a couple of reasons. First of all, Bashar al-Assad has the support of the Russian and Chinese governments, and he's not going anywhere, whether we like it or not. Secondly, Bashar al-Assad has a long history of being supportive of Christian and other minority ethnic and religious groups in Syria. There is a vibrant Orthodox, Antiochian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and Catholic trading class in Syria. There are Christians who are members of the cabinet. The foreign minister is a Christian. There are women who are in the cabinet. There are women who are in the parliament. There's an active Jewish community in Damascus. They have one of the oldest continuously operating synagogues on the planet. And you want to overthrow them and put in al-Qaeda? I mean, what kind of policy is that? What kind of foreign policy is that? In addition to that, Donald Trump, when he was president, decided to maintain the special forces presence that Barack Obama had established in northeastern Syria to, quote, guard the oil fields. Well, you know what? That's a war crime, right? You can Google it. That's a war crime. You cannot occupy an area of any country for the purpose of seizing their national resources.
Thousands of years in the process between borders between these countries and other countries that we're involved with 7,000 miles away. So we want to worry about our things. We're keeping the oil. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil. And I have to just finish by saying that.
Number one. Number two, there are only three ways that you can militarily occupy a foreign country. If you've been invited in by that country, as the Russians have, by an order of the United Nations Security Council, which has never happened in the case of Syria. And number three, if that country has attacked you militarily. So just the fact that the US is there in the first place is an international war crime. It's like every aspect of this policy is wrong, every single aspect of it. We need to walk away from Syria.
I know you have to jump off soon, so I will kind of start to finish up there. But yeah, of course, the US is still in Syria, and obviously since what's been going on in the region with Israel and Palestine and Hamas, they've come under fire many times in Syria and Iraq, which people might think the US is still even in Syria and Iraq to get fired at. And I will put I put kind of everything in the show notes. I'll play that clip of Donald Trump referring directly to they stayed there for the oil to probably more not to. They've kind of been waiting to see what to do with certain oil, but more just to take it away from them, as it's kind of they've discussed. But yeah, it was really great to have you. Do you just want to let people know the books that you've written, where to find your work?
Oh, sure.
Again,
I've written 8 books now.
Encourage people to go back to these like Autumn.
Oh, sure. Thank you. I've written 8 books so far. Most of them are on intelligence and the CIA and foreign policy. They're all out there on Amazon and wherever books are. And I'm on Substack. I post all my work on Substack under John Kiriakou.